Hello, I'm Samantha DeRosa, Associate Professor of Art and Environmental Studies and Faculty Fellow for Sustainability here at Elon. I am also a graduate student again in the Mental Health Counseling Program at Appalachian State University, studying expressive arts therapy. And for the last several years, I've been mentoring with various folks on the West Coast in working with grief and community, grief tending, as we commonly call it. I see an important relationship between how we care for the planet and how we care for ourselves. These are not mutually exclusive. So to me, living sustainably means tending to our emotional, mental, and physical health also. I'm here today to talk about eco-anxiety and eco-grief, and to begin to build some literacy, not just around the understanding of these conditions of our current times, but literacy around practices we can employ to navigate them. Practices will happen in groups here on campus, and this video helps provide an entry point into why the practices, particularly the communal ones, are important. And in other videos, I'll be talking about personal practices we can bring into our lives to help work with and mitigate the discomfort that invariably comes with any anxiety or grief. So what is eco-anxiety? The American Psychological Association defines the condition of eco-anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom. It was officially named in 2017 and is on a rapid rise. From my understanding, the Climate Psychology Alliance is campaigning, or has at least campaigned, for the condition to be added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, used by therapists, counselors, and psychologists in diagnosis and treatment. If we peel back some onion layers on eco-anxiety, I believe that underneath we find great grief. Some folks might refer to it even as anticipatory grief, fear over what we might be losing, including a way of life that is dependent upon immensely unsustainable practices, extraction, consumption. And we're attached to this way of life, right? Myself included. So I will focus mostly on the grief piece here, with some aspects of anxiety, bring in those aspects also, so we can begin to tease this all out a bit. In the upcoming program on October 19th and others like it, we'll be tending to our grief in community. So what is eco-grief? I'll get to that later, but first, grief and grief tending itself needs some demystification. Grief tending, which is the processing, being present with, working with grief in community, is a skill to develop. One of my mentors in this work has argued that it's a skill we've lost as we've become disconnected from our ancient indigenous villages and from the rituals and ceremonies that honor events of loss. Though with practice, we can become more fluent, but it's not comfortable generally. For most of us, it requires growing some edges. Growing our edges. With practices, we can develop a holdfast that makes us stronger when there is turbulence. I love ecosystem metaphors. This reference, from my understanding, comes from sea kelp beds. And sea kelp isn't strongly rooted in the ocean floor. It attaches to rock via chemical reaction that's super strong, and it helps to stabilize the shoreline during big storms. So these practices become a holdfast or a ballast, in a sense, for us, for the storms that come through our bodies and our hearts. Doing this work, in essence, becoming midwives of grief, helps us to transmute acrimony and hopelessness into medicine. In this work, communal witnessing is key, which seems counterintuitive to our cultural conditioning, which privatizes grief and most other difficult emotions. I heard a story recently that I'll share here, and these are the words of writer Thomas Christopher Green, novelist and president of Vermont College of Fine Arts. And this is up in Montpelier, Vermont, which is a small city, even though it's the capital of Vermont. I think there's 6,000 people population. And here are his words. Not long before COVID hit, back when we could be shoulder to shoulder with people, when I used to go out just to find a conversation and some stories after a day of writing, I was having a beer with a friend at Three Penny Tap Room. The bar was packed, the back wall lined with legislators, a Friday night. My friend is a Jamaican immigrant. He paints houses for a living. We were in the middle of a conversation about sports when his phone started to vibrate and buzz on the wood of the bar. "Oh, that's my daughter," he said, and he answered right away there in the noisy bar. "What?" he shouted. "You got into Harvard?" And then he turned to the entire noisy bar, taking the phone off his ear, his voice mostly lost in the din of music and glasses being shuffled across the wood in loud conversation. "My daughter got into Harvard," he yelled. He yelled it again and again. And now his energy was so kinetic, he couldn't contain himself. He was off his stool and running down the length of the bar, holding his phone in the air and yelling, "My daughter got into Harvard." He ran back and forth yelling it, holding his phone out. I watched as slowly others became aware of the profound pride of this father who was going to make sure everyone knew about it. It was one of the purest expressions of joy I have ever seen. And because we're a small town and we all know each other, the bartender heard what he was saying and began to clang a large bell that was behind the bar in celebration. And because of that, even over the music, everyone heard him. "My daughter got into Harvard." And for a moment, all the individual conversations stopped and everyone paid attention to this simple fact. And at once, suddenly, everyone clapped louder and louder, and my friend held out his phone so his daughter could hear it. "She worked her butt off," he yelled. 4 years of straight A's. So the context of this story was actually in grieving a bit of not being able to just be in community with people very easily, and how these magical moments that erupt in community we're not experiencing right now. And so that's its own source of grief, right? I heard this story a little bit differently from my lens. I imagined, what if the call were about something horrific, some unimaginable news? God forbid, the death of his daughter or his partner or something else. And he ran through the Three Penny Tavern, sharing and screaming about it in the crowd. I think it's not a stretch to imagine that there wouldn't be the same reception. And of course, there shouldn't be the clapping and all of that. I mean, however, but reception. I don't know that there would be any reception. I think people would be really uncomfortable. They might try to ignore him. They'd feel empathy and some sympathy, but not know what to do with it, because we often don't know what to do in those situations. At any rate, it wouldn't be as accepted as that story in the events as it actually did unfold. So why community? Why the necessity of witnessing? When we privatize grief or loss or illness or fill in the blank, we imbue it with shame. How many times have we thought or have heard someone say, "I should be able to get over this. What's wrong with me?" And this is something I've heard quite a bit in the work that I do. Or how many times have we apologized for crying or heard someone apologize for crying when they're telling us something and tears are falling and they're saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." But we don't apologize for laughing or smiling, right? I mean, not generally, unless it's really the wrong context. In the expression of grief, there is tremendous vitality. And there's vitality in the expression of joy and ecstasy, as we saw with the man in the Three Penny tap room. Why do we pick and choose what is welcome in the house? In the words of my mentor, Francis Weller, he says, grief, pain, suffering, loss, they're not easy guests, but they're inevitable. And we need to develop a relationship and intimacy with those guests. So I want to share a poem by Rumi called The Guest House, which is really appropriate for what we're talking about here. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. In this work, we don't regard grief as just an emotion, but a core human faculty that we've neglected. Like in my imagined story of the man in the tavern, we don't often know how to respond to grief when it arrives on our doorstep. Again, referencing Rumi's poem. If grief, loss, pain arrives at the door, do we say, "Come in for tea, please"? Sit down, have some cake? No. We generally batten down the hatches. We look for the exit to flee, not just with others, but within ourselves also. When we gather in community to work with grief, we'll be building our capacity to lean into it, to walk with it, maybe even to dance with it. That's one of our objectives. I want to return to anxiety a bit. Living in the ideology of individualism, which we all do in this culture, our separate self is often wary, unsure, anxious. The eco-spiritual writers and poets often talk about how we've lost our sense of intricate belonging and intimacy with the natural and animate world that once held us. In a culture of individualism, our identities have become small. We forget we are part rain, part antelope, part wind, part prairie. We forget how we're all connected. So of course, the separate self might feel anxious. And our psyches are porous. We live in an ambient field of grief, anxiety, and despair. And that registers in our bodies. So now I want to read a bit about eco-grief. And this is from Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which I highly recommend. And in this book, which explores a lot about grief, but he describes 5 gates that we enter into in order to arrive at the communal hall of grief. So in this communal hall, we have all different things that we're grieving, and the 5 gates represent different events, experiences that usher us in there. The 3rd gate is the sorrows for the world, and that's directly linked to eco-grief. Okay, so the 3rd gate, sorrows for the world. Whether or not we consciously recognize it, the daily diminishment of species, habitats, and cultures is noted in our psyches. Much of the grief we carry is not personal, but shared, communal. It is difficult to walk down the street and not feel the collective sorrows of homelessness or the economic insanity revealed in commercialism and consumerism. It takes everything we have to deny the sorrows of the world. We can travel just about anywhere in the world, and we will inevitably come across vestiges of clear cuts, those bleeding and scarred lands that look so desolate and violated. These places announce themselves as a wound, a rupture where life once moved and breathed. Our hearts sink into a deep grief in these times. Western psychology would most likely suggest that the grief we are feeling is related to our own experience of being diminished as a child, a metaphoric clear cut, as it were. What if, however, the feelings we have when we pass through these zones of destruction are actually arising from the land itself? What if it is the grief of the forest registering in our bodies and psyches, the sorrow of the redwoods, voles, sorrel, ferns, owls, and deer, all those who lost their homes and lives as a result of this plundering of living beings? What if we are not separate from the world at all? What if this is the anima mundi, the soul of the world, weeping through us? We know and feel in our bones that something primal is amiss. Our extended home is being eroded, as is the experience of our wider self. It is good manners to respond with sorrow, outrage, and apology at these places touched by so much loss. The cumulative grief of the world is overwhelming. The litany of losses could fill this book. Our ways of living have become corrosive to the earth, to prairie dogs and grizzly bears, to bluefin tuna and monarch butterflies and cultures. Every day we see the dead lying by the side of the road, deer, raccoons, skunk, possums, and foxes. Shopping malls homogenize the landscape of our communities, turning them into a bland slurry. We are depleting with an ever-growing tenacity the complex, multi-layered song of the world and replacing it with a single-pitched monotone, depositing empty calories, sterile seeds, and meaningless objects in every developing country while silencing forever the voices of hundreds of cultures. Every few weeks, a language is lost, and along with it, a nuanced imagination of a people who were rooted to a place for perhaps thousands of years. How can we possibly stay open to the endless assaults on the biosphere when the urge to avert our eyes and pretend that we don't feel this pain takes over? So Francis Weller talks about how we must take up an apprenticeship with grief, an apprenticeship with sorrow, learn to digest it, compost it. And through tending to our sorrows, we can encounter what it means to be alive. Interestingly, the more we make room for grief and sadness, the more room we make for joy and happiness. If we're paying attention to the world, indeed our hearts will break. And in nature, certain seeds only break open when the fire comes. And that's our orientation to this work. It begins with an invitation to ourselves and to others. One final thing I will share before I close. Grief is not something to be solved like gluing together a broken vase. We're such a consummate fix-it culture, which includes fixing ourselves. Implicit in that is that there's something wrong with us. And in that perspective, when we deny parts of ourselves, like our grief and our sadness, they become exiled. Grief tending is a process like eating and eliminating. Robert Bly, the poet, referred to it as psychic ex-lax. So there's no fixing in this work. Through grief tending, we're reclaiming the spaciousness in our hearts, just as we reclaim spaciousness in our intestines after elimination. So there's no solution to grief, especially eco-grief, because it is ongoing. There's no answer, only a response. So that's the core question. What is the quality of my response? Back to Rumi again. How do we meet our grief? How do we meet that guest? Here's a quote by the poet, the Irish poet John O'Donoghue. What you encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree on the quality of your approach. Many of the ancient cultures practice careful rituals of approach. When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. Our real life comes to the surface, and its light awakens the concealed beauty in things. So what might happen when we respond to our grief out of love and affection? That will be a living question as we proceed, coming together communally to share in our collective eco-grief. We'll leave you with one poem called Bearing Witness by Laura Weaver. Sometimes we are asked to stop and bear witness. This the elephants say to me in dreams as they thunder through the passageways of my heart, disappearing into a blaze of stars. On the edge of the sixth mass extinction, with species vanishing before our eyes, we'd be a people gone mad if we did not grieve. This unmet grief, an elder tells me, is the root of the collective illness that got us here. As people stay current with their grief, they see their tears like medicine, and grief a kind of generous willingness to simply see, to look loss in the eye, to hold tenderly what is precious, to let the reins of the heart fall. In this way, they do not pass this weight on in invisible mailbags for the next generation to carry. In this way, the grief doesn't build and build like sets of waves until, at some point down the line, it simply becomes an unbearable ocean. We are so hungry when we are fleeing our grief, when we are doing all we can to distract ourselves from the crushing heft of the unread letters of our ancestors. Hear us, they call, hear us. In my dreams, the elephants stampede in herds, trumpeting, shaking the earth. It is a kind of grand finale, a last parade of their exquisite beauty. See us, they say, we may not pass this way again. What if our grief, given as a sacred offering, is a blessing, not a curse? What if our grief, not hidden away in corners, becomes a kind of communion where we shine? What if our grief becomes a liberation song that returns us to our innocence? What if our fierce hearts could simply bear witness? Thank you. Hope to see you in an upcoming program.